What ho, apothecary! Who calls so loud? Come hither, man. I see that thou art poor. Hold, here is 40 ducats. Let me have a dram of poison. This is the famous first scene from Act 5 of Romeo and Juliet. Romeo seeks a poison that will put Juliet to sleep, and he bribed the impoverished apothecary to sell him some. Like Raphe Walley, whose inventory is held at Nantwich Museum, Shakespeare's apothecary was of the poorer sort, although Shakespeare's apothecary was not averse to a little bribery. But what was an apothecary, and where did they go? Well, my name's Nicholas Wood, and I hope to be able to tell you, since I'm a liveryman and a past master and the honorary curator of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries of London. And the word apothecary originally just means a storekeeper. And nowadays, of course, their role is taken by pharmacists, who I happen to be as well. So apothecaries, pharmacists, physicians, were all knowledgeable about medicines, and they've been known to exist from earliest times. Sometimes they were what amounted to physicians, and sometimes there was a separate pharmaceutical speciality. Egyptian, Greek, Roman and Chinese civilizations all show evidence of the use of drugs, but it was probably Hippocrates, a Greek, and then Galen, the Roman physician, who most contributed to the systematization of Western medical practice, with treatments that were based on observation rather than on spells or potions or superstition, or indeed the invocation of the gods. In doing so, Galen laid the foundations of drug treatment based on natural products, that's herbal products largely, known forever in his honor as Galenic medicines. The Greeks and the Romans often got things heroically wrong, but physicians like Dioscorides produced useful books on materia medica, effectively encyclopedias of herbal drugs and treatments. However, much of this knowledge was lost with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Most people continued to use folk medicines, herbs, spells, superstition anyway, and only vestiges of the classical knowledge systems and remedies persisted in Europe after the fall of Rome, and they were preserved in the church and in the monasteries of the so-called Dark Ages. The knowledge, however, was retained in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, in Constantinople and beyond. Great centers of learning of Islam and of the Arab empires translated and preserved the ancient writings, and Islamic scholars added their own ideas, and it's known that the first pharmacy shop appeared in Baghdad in the 9th century. Meanwhile, in Europe, after the fall of Rome, where some residual knowledge was retained in the monasteries and other religious institutions, learned clerics would have been available to the aristocratic and higher classes. Kings and other important personages had their own physician monks, and it's known, for example, that physicians and surgeons to William the Conqueror included the Bishop of Lisieux and Baldwin, the Abbot of St. Edmundsbury. But most ordinary people relied on folklore and tradition, the wise woman and the leech, a sort of medieval doctor in England. So it was the advent of the Crusades, with travellers going east to the Holy Land, that started to reintroduce to the West to the lost knowledge of the Greeks and Romans. About 1100, medical practice by lay persons rather than by clergy began to re-emerge in Europe, and medical schools studying the ancient Greek and Roman writings began to appear in the new universities that were being founded in Europe, including the foundation of a medical school at Salerno in Italy in the 9th century. Moreover, with the movement of people across Europe during the Crusades, international trade in herbs and spices began to gather pace. So this reintroduced classical knowledge of medicine put great store on diet. Hence, it's not surprising that the early sellers of imported herbs and spices were dealers in general foodstuffs, such as grocers and similar merchants. Grocer apothecaries began to appear in the 11th and 12th centuries, both in England and in Europe. However, there is contemporary evidence that the practice of medicine by poorly educated lay persons led to sufficient harm amongst the populace to warrant the attention of the civic authorities. And in 1241, Frederick II, who was king of the Two Sicilies and the Holy Roman Emperor, promulgated the Edict of Salerno throughout his realm, regulating medical education and separating the practice of medicine from the practice of pharmacy. Now, amongst other provisions, physicians were not allowed to own an apothecary's shop or have a business relationship with an individual apothecary, since abuses could arise if a physician based their patient's treatment on the most expensive or perhaps the most available drug that was held in stock, rather than the most appropriate. Now, although the Emperor's writ did not run as far as Britain, the edict was the West's first attempt to regulate the practice of medicine and pharmacy, and has had an influence on European medical practice ever since. Now, this period of the Middle Ages also saw the emergence across Europe of the trade guilds, with apothecaries within them. England was no exception, and records show that there was a guild of pepperers in London by 1180. We know they were there by 1180 because that was when they got fined for having a guild that hadn't been approved by the king. Guilds of spicers emerged soon afterwards, and from these origins, the Grocers' Company in London, which included the apothecaries, arose in 1345. So the purpose of these guilds was to provide mutual support, to maintain standards, and to support education by supervising apprenticeships, and all tradesmen were required to undertake apprenticeships before they could start up in business. Banding together originally as religious fraternities with a patron saint, they had the charitable care of widows and orphans in the fraternity, but also looked after the commercial and educational interests of members. Guilds were referred to as companies because of the custom, possibly originating in the shipping guilds of Genoa, of eating bread together, con pani. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Bear with me. In London, the city's apothecaries, who had developed from these spicers and pepperers, functioned as a section of the powerful Grocers' Company until the early 17th century. Grocers being so called because they wholesaled products on gross. By the early 17th century, the Grocers' Company in London was very powerful, with many members having served in prominent roles in the city. It did have a role of inspecting its members for substandard drugs and medicines, but many members of the Grocers' Company simply did not have the skills for the role of an apothecary. In 1607, the revised charter of the company recognized the apothecaries as a distinct section of the grocers. This, by the way, is the still existing Grocers' Company coat of arms. And you might notice that on there are a number of cloves, showing that that was the sort of thing they dealt in. And on top, a camel, indicating that many of their exotic products came from the east by camel train. So although London was by far the largest city in England, many other cities and towns had trade guilds. In Chester, a guild of grocers and apothecaries was in existence by the mid-1500s. Against this background of grocers and apothecaries being present in many towns throughout the country, physicians were thin on the ground. Educated largely in the universities in the rediscovered classical knowledge of the Greeks and Romans, what few physicians there were jealous and protective of their position. Many people therefore turned to the apothecary for advice and treatment, something of which these university-educated physicians objected to strongly. Turf wars between the apothecaries and the physicians became a common feature of the 16th and 17th and 18th century, not to mention the additional presence of the barber surgeons, who treated injuries and external complaints, and who, like the apothecaries, learnt their trade by apprenticeship. And here's I think it's a Dutch painting of a barber surgeon at work. I think they were a bit like practice nurses, probably. They certainly set bones, did wounds. They very rarely actually operated on people, but a lot of external things were treated by the barber surgeons. So they, like the apothecaries, learned their trade by apprenticeship, in contrast to the university-educated physicians who regarded themselves as a cut above. However, the overall pattern of apothecaries in trade guilds and educated by apprenticeship was common over most of the country. That's not to say that people didn't sometimes obtain their medical treatment, including medicines, through the religious houses. But of course, such houses declined after the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. A word about physicians. Medical practice was unregulated at the start of the 16th century, although, as I've said before, the church had a role. In 1511, a new act under Henry VIII came into force regulating those who practiced medicine. Those who practiced in London were licensed to do so by the Bishop of London or the Dean of St. Paul's, and a small expert committee of medical men was appointed to assist them and advise them, and similar rules applied to other dioceses. A College of Physicians was created by Henry in 1518, and it gained examining, licensing, and policing powers over medical practice. A degree was normally required to obtain the license, as well as a classical education, the ability to read all that Greek and Latin. And for many years, the full fellowship was restricted to graduates from Oxford and Cambridge. Now, apothecaries dispensed the prescriptions of these physicians, and herbals were in use to help identify plant drugs, and dispensatories contained recipes for products like syrups and electors. But the dispensatories or formula books varied with different formula for the same product. So some authorities, such as the city-states, started to issue official books, the formularies of which were standardized and had to be followed by apothecaries. The first of these appears to have been in Florence in 1498. And by the 16th and 17th century in England, standardization of formulas and medicines had become a problem. The College of Physicians in London considered producing a pharmacopoeia, that is a standard textbook of medicines, in 1585, with a standard formula of recipes. Now this, by the way, this picture is of a Gerard's herbal, dating from about 1630s, in the possession of the Society of Apothecaries. However, the Pharmacopoeia Londiniensis took many years to produce, only coming out in 1618, but it was swiftly superseded about 6 months later by a rather better edition, correcting all the mistakes that was in the first one. James I and VI decreed that all apothecaries should work from this Pharmacopoeia Londiniensis. Written in Latin, it provided just the instructions to make the medicines, with no indication of what conditions the medicine was to be used for. It laid down formulas and standards which apothecaries were obliged to conform with when preparing the physician's prescriptions. Moreover, the College of Physicians was given a role in the inspection of drugs, but otherwise had limited power to regulate apothecaries and prevent them from practicing medicine. There then ensued centuries-long turf wars between physicians and apothecaries about who could prescribe, which to an extent can still be said to have echoes today. In London, there were enough apothecaries to break away and form their own guild separate from the grocers, which they did in 1617. This Society of Apothecaries in London still exists as a livery company in the city, maintaining a considerable involvement in medical education from its ancient hall in Blackfriars. Although apothecaries may have had some knowledge of some Latin, they may also have had access to some of the translated versions of the Pharmacopoeia, printed primarily by that rogue apothecary, Nicholas Culpeper, and his London dispensatory came out in the mid-1600s when he had the temerity to translate from the Latin Pharmacopoeia into plain English. To complicate matters, a new fashion for chemical medicines was developing following the innovations of Paracelsus. At this time, the teachings of Paracelsus were gaining ground, suggesting the use of chemicals and minerals in medicine, whereas medical tradition had been of Galenicals, Galen's medicines of natural or herbal origin, associated sometimes with the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures was just the idea that if a plant's leaf looked like a liver, it was useful for treating liver disease. Nevertheless, in the mid-1600s, a small number of traders with laboratories had emerged producing the new chemicals. And the new chemical medicines promoted by Paracelsus were known in the mid-1600s, but at first they only formed a small part of medicine in general. However, they were to grow in importance, and in subsequent years it led to the rise of a new class of men, the chemists and druggists, who had come to challenge the monopoly of the apothecaries. So although traditionally the landscape of medical practice would have been seen as physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, the physicians being university educated at Oxford or Cambridge or on the continent, the surgeons, members of a craft guild, and the apothecaries as traders in a trade guild. In reality, the divisions were far from clear. What's more, in the 1600s was the turbulent times of the English Civil War and the plagues. It created situations where the apothecaries increasingly began to treat the sick because of the dearth of physicians. This was to have far-reaching consequences in the future. Over the next 150 years, the apothecaries increasingly took on the role of the physician, becoming themselves general practitioners of medicine, which is why that in the following centuries, the role of a pharmacist was taken over by the new class of people, the chemists and druggists, pharmacy having been abandoned by the apothecaries as they turned to the practice of medicine. But we're jumping too far ahead of time. What can we deduce about Raphe Walley and his practice as an apothecary in Nantwich? And I'm going to break now and hand you back to Helen.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that excellent introduction to the history of apothecaries. And it now falls to me to provide a bit of local perspective, I suppose, by talking a little bit more about Raphe Walley, who is the 17th century Nantwich apothecary, who was really, without his knowledge, of course, because he's so long gone, he was the inspiration for putting together this talk and also for developing materials about there's an information panel in the museum's Ouch exhibition that's on display at the moment that features apothecaries too. So Rafe was kind of the inspiration behind that as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about apothecaries in Nantwich in general, and I'm then going to talk about how we went about the research into finding out more about Raphe Walley, and also I'll talk a bit about what life was like in Nantwich during Rafe's time in the town in the 17th century. So there are lots of different ways that you can find out about apothecaries or any other trade for that matter in towns across the country. And in Nantwich we have a number of trade directories that can be referred to. So for example, one of them is Cowdroy's directory from 1789, and just browsing through that, you can look through a list of all the traders in the town at that time. And usually they do have, that, as well as the names, of course, they have what their particular trade was. So you'll see hopefully you can read on this slide on the right-hand section, which is a larger font than the section on the left, that we have two apothecaries there. We've got William Kent, and then further down, we've got Joseph Gardner, who was actually a surgeon and an apothecary. So of course, when we say surgeon, we really do mean a barber surgeon in the same sort of context that Nick was talking about just now. Now, the Kent family are actually quite interesting because almost any trade directory that you look at in that for around about 100 years did in fact feature Kents because there was a whole dynasty almost of apothecaries in the town at the time. And to make life a little bit more interesting for people who are doing family history research and so on, most of them are called William, but there are a few exceptions. But we do have one William listed here, of course, on this slide. So the Kent family, I'll just say a couple of words about them because they are quite interesting. Two of the Kents went on to fulfil significant roles outside of Nantwich. So one that wasn't called William was called Matthew Kent, and he was born in 1773. And he was the grandson of an apothecary in Nantwich, who was one of the William Kents, who happened to die in 1773, just by coincidence. Anyway, Matthew Kent joined the Royal Navy, and he's recorded as being promoted from assistant surgeon at Greenwich Hospital to dispenser and apothecary at the same hospital in 1809. So he had quite a good career, having moved away from Nantwich. Now, Matthew's son, yes, you guessed it, another William Kent, was born in Nantwich in 1801, and he became an assistant surgeon on HMS Beagle, which of course was naturalist Charles Darwin's ship, and so he went all around the world. I think he was actually on the Beagle for a period of about 3 years. So the Kents were quite a well-known family through the ages. So there was almost always at least one apothecary in Nantwich across all the centuries, and sometimes there was more than one at the same time. So a little bit more now about what we know about Raphe Walley. Well, he was born in 1625, and he was brought up near Middlewich in Kinderton, which is, I think, about 13 miles away from Nantwich, quite a little bit further than that, actually. And he was born. There's also amongst the records, the baptism records of Middlewich. If you look at the parish register of St Michael and All Angels Church of Middlewich, there is a baptism record for William Wally. And William Wally was born in 1614, which makes him, of course, about 11 years older than Raphe Walley. Now, William, he actually went to Oxford University. He was at Brasenose College, as far as we know, and he qualified as a physician. So just coming back to Nick's point earlier on, there was a certain amount of elitism amongst the medical practitioners of the time, and the physicians were kind of top of the tree and the apothecaries were a little bit lower down in the pecking order. But William, he was based in Nantwich, and he practiced as a barber surgeon and an apothecary, as well as being a physician in the town. And it's quite possible that Rafe, being 11 years younger than William, may have moved from Middlewich to Nantwich to follow William by moving away to perhaps a bigger town where there were more opportunities. Now, unfortunately, there's a gap between 1620 and 1687, which is the time period when Rafe would have been in training as an apprentice apothecary. There's a gap exists in the Chester City apprenticeship records that are held by the Cheshire Archives. So we haven't been able to find out who Rafe was actually apprenticed to, but it might be reasonable to guess that he would have been apprenticed to William, his older brother, because it was quite common for people to be apprenticed to relatives, and due to the age difference, it would have been quite a natural thing for Rafe to have done. So we know that. We do know also that Rafe married Mary Challoner at St Mary's Church in Nantwich in 1648. So he would have been 23 years old at the time, and in all likelihood, he would have just completed his apprenticeship with William or whoever it might have been. We're not quite sure, of course. Now, the couple had a daughter who was also named Mary. There's an awful lot of Marys in this section of the talk. St Mary's Church, Mary Challoner, and then Mary, who is Rafe's daughter. And she was baptized at St Mary's also in 1648. And if you check the dates, it was 9 months and 3 days after they got married. So Rafe was having a very interesting year. He probably completed his apprenticeship at that point. He got married and then had his daughter all in quick succession. We haven't seen any records to suggest that Rafe and Mary, his wife, had any more children. So we think there was just one daughter, Mary. Rafe sadly passed away at a relatively young age of 36, predeceasing his older brother William and also predeceasing his wife. So age 36, that was, these days particularly, we would consider that to be a very young age for somebody to pass away. And it's quite easy to sort of assume or think that perhaps the environment in which Rafe worked in his apothecary shop may not have been conducive to a long life, because there would have been quite a lot of nasty substances in there, which may not have made for a very healthy environment. Okay, so a little bit about Rafe's time in, what life would have been like for Rafe in Nantwich at the time. This is a 1691 map of Nantwich, which some of you who've come to the talks that Nantwich Museum organises before, you might have come across this map. I know I've used it in talks before, but this map it's not a particularly accurate map, and it is 30 years after Rafe would have died, or he did die. But nevertheless, we don't think the town would have changed an awful lot in that time period. Now, the streets, if you look at the key on the top left, you'll see that a lot of the streets that those of you who are from Nantwich, you'd be familiar with the names of the streets that are listed there. And that there is a code that sort of links them to the places on the map as well. Now, the scale of the map is possibly a little inaccurate. It's in paces rather than in feet and inches and yards, or whatever we might have expected at the time. So all in all, it's a little bit amateurish in appearance, but it's rather an attractive map nevertheless. Now, this next picture is painted by the museum's artist, Les Pickford, and it represents Market Day in the 17th century. And it was painted and on display at an exhibition that we held about 4 or 5 years ago now, called Nantwich Besieged, which was all about the siege of Nantwich, which took place in the mid-1600s. So this is Les's impression of what Nantwich might have looked like on Market Day. Now, Nantwich was quite a prosperous town relative to some other places. It was the second town in Chester, second most important town in Cheshire, with Chester, of course, being the county town. It was at the crossroads, or a junction, I should say, perhaps, of a number of important trade routes. And we did, of course, have a very important salt industry in Nantwich, which was still ongoing in the 1600s, even though it was perhaps a little bit on the decline by that time. Other trades, of course, there's the cheese and dairy industries in the surrounding countryside, and also leather and shoemaking and various other trades. So Nantwich was, to a large degree, self-sufficient during that time period. And so Rafe would have benefited in his apothecary shop from having a lot of passing trade, because people would be coming into Nantwich to go to the markets, to visit the shops and so on, much like they do nowadays, I suppose. And people would have travelled probably quite long distances sometimes to get to their local apothecary. The population of Nantwich at the time would have been between about 3,800 and 4,200. But of course, in the mid-1600s, this was at the time of the Civil War. So Rafe would have in fact he would have been in training very much during the Civil War. The Battle of Nantwich was in 1644, so it's quite likely that Rafe would have been an apprentice at that time. And the town, even once the battle had taken place and had been won by the parliamentarians, so there would have been lots of troops and soldiers and so on marching through the town and residing with the local residents in the town as well. So it would have been quite a difficult and unsettled time which Rafe was practicing in Nantwich. So how did we go about doing the research around Raphe Walley? How did we discover Raphe Walley, and how did we actually do the research? Well, at Nantwich Museum, we have a list of 17th century wills and inventories. So inventories, by inventories in this context, I mean inventories that were put together after someone had died for probate purposes, to establish the wealth or the value of the possessions of the person who had passed away. So we have a very good list of 17th century wills and inventories at the museum. So one day I thought, well, I'll have a look through and see if I can find any apothecaries amongst all of these wills and inventories. And I found quite a few, but the only one where we had a transcript of the inventory was actually Raphe Walley. So you can see at the bottom of this slide, the section that's at the bottom there, that Raphe Walley, the inventory for Raphe Walley was actually put together on the 22nd of October, 1661, and he had died on the 17th of September. He was buried on the 17th of September, 1661. We don't know the exact date of his death, but it can't have been very long before that September date. So he's labelled as being an apothecary in this list of wills and inventories, and somebody has put High Street over there on the right-hand side. And I think I know whose writing this is. It's a member of our research group, Andrew Lamberton, I think, who probably annotated this list with the location that he believes that Raphe Walley, where he probably lived. So with this knowledge, and I do trust Andrew's judgment on these things very much, where do we think that Raphe Walley's apothecary shop might have been in Nantwich? Well, the buildings that are shown here, we think these are actually in Town Square, Nantwich, which High Street is one of the streets that passes through the town square, of course. And I like to think that perhaps Raphe Walley was based in a building which it was Grice's Chemists. And those of you who've lived in Nantwich for a long time may may recognize Grice's Chemist as a business that was located in Town Square. Now, the picture on the left is from around about 1900, and Grice's is way over on the left-hand side of that picture. And I only really include it because I like the picture of the fire engine in front of the buildings very, very much, and the fire brigade that are in attendance as well. But the picture on the right-hand side of the picture is a more recent one from the 1960s. We think that picture was taken. So Grice's Chemist, I don't know what year it actually was closed, but it's just kind of nice to think that maybe there was an apothecary or a chemist business in that property all through the decades and the centuries between Rafe's time and more modern times. Okay, so this is a picture. Those of you who've been watching the publicity that we've been doing for the talk will have seen this picture. And again, it's another one of Les Pickford's artworks. And Les painted this based on the research information that we provide him with, and also Les does very thorough research himself, so he was looking at all the different paintings and pictures he could find from that period of apothecary businesses. So you can see that we've got all the pots and jars and things on the shelves, and a little cabinet there in which Rafe would have perhaps kept his ingredients for the remedies that he was going to be dispensing from his apothecary business. And we have a rather sickly looking child there, unfortunately, who looks like maybe Rafe is looking something up in one of his books, or in a book, to find out what would be the best treatment for the person who was not feeling well. So apologies if you struggle seeing this slide. The font may be a little bit small on the screen, unfortunately, but I just wanted to let us think for a moment or two about what the diseases and hazards in Nantwich might have been in the 17th century that Rafe would have had to deal with, or what he might have been able to help with the remedies that he was dispensing. And you can see from this is a timeline that actually features at the Ouch exhibition, the one that's on in the museum at the moment, which talks a lot about healthcare, all different aspects of healthcare over the ages. And you can see that this is the section from the 17th century, and you can see that in red text, we have the illnesses, and in blue text, we have disasters and hazards. Well, Rafe wouldn't have been able to do very much about the disasters and hazards that are listed here, because there were floods, and then of course the Battle of Nantwich. But we'd hope that he might have something that could deal with plague. He wouldn't have been in business, of course, in 1680, so the smallpox was after his time. But plague was definitely around, even though we don't think there were any deaths from plague, not that we know of, in Nantwich at the precise time that Rafe was there. There was plague beforehand, and then there was plague probably afterwards. But in 1647, you'll see that there were in fact 26 deaths from plague in Wisterston, which isn't very far away from Nantwich. So it's quite possible that people would have come to Nantwich and visited Raphe Walley in order to get some medications to help with their problems. So how could he have helped? Well, if you look through his inventory, you can see quite a few things that are mentioned in Culpepper's Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, which Nick mentioned a little bit earlier on. And nicotine or tobacco ointment, and I think Nick's going to mention these in the second part of his talk, theriacs, which were kind of cure-alls that could be used to tackle all sorts of things. And then there was one specifically called Pilulae Raphe, and I may well have got the pronunciation of that completely wrong. So that is actually listed in the inventory, and it had a multitude of different medical properties. It was definitely a laxative amongst many other things. And also in his inventory, you can see listed the individual ingredients that were required in order to make up this particular medication. So he may well have been making this from scratch, like apothecaries did. They would often fabricate their own remedies and medications. Okay, I'm going to finish now. I've probably overrun, and I apologize for that. But I did want to just thank a few people who helped with the research and preparing the information that's gone into this slide, and also to the exhibition, the parts of the exhibition that I was involved with. So Charles Ferry, Linda Briggs, Janet Alate, Lesbic, of course, and also to Cheshire Archives, because they were a very important source of information for us. So I'm going to stop sharing now and hand back to Nick, who's going to talk a bit more about Raphe Walley's inventory.
Right, I hope you can hear me again. So this is Raphe Walley's inventory. They're some of the original ones. As we've just heard, in order to practice as an apothecary, young Wally must have served an apprenticeship, perhaps with his brother, perhaps with somebody else. Perhaps it was supervised by a trade guild, could have been in the trade guild in Chester, where there was the guild for grocers and apothecaries. But he'd had to have done 7 or 8 years with his master and then set up shop on his own account. But the inventory that we've got here tells us a great deal about his work as an apothecary. It shows that he and his family occupied a building with several chambers and with a shop. And here's some of the internal things. Obvious things such as bed linen. It's not clear which of the equipment listed was domestic equipment. And for example, we've got here mention of several mortars and pestles, 2 stills, which I think would have been part of his work inventory. And possibly from this list of things, there's rather more that you would expect in a domestic kitchen. So it could be part of his inventory of his equipment in the shop. However, we have a very straightforward inventory of what was in the shop. The comprehensive list in Wally's inventory can be seen to reflect the items laid down in that Pharmacopoeia Londinensis and then were in standard use in medicine. It starts with things like rosewater, cinnamon and aniseed. Aniseed, for example, was described by Nicholas Culpeper as a stimulant, aromatic and carminative used to relieve flatulence and griping. And the inventory then goes on to list other things according to their pharmaceutical form as defined in the Pharmacopoeia. And this includes electuaries, which are a thick paste form of medicine, smeared onto the tongue, pills, troches, which are lozenges, and unguentum, which are ointments. But I've tried to put here the transcription alongside what actually appears in the inventory. So this is an electuary. There's some specific medicines that are being used here. Interesting one here. The classic one is Theriac londiniensis, or London treacle. And this had more than 20 ingredients, including sorrel, marigolds, rosemary, ginger, mace, and opium, all mixed with honey to make a thick paste. And I think you'll have seen that was mentioned, or something similar, in the treatment for the plague. Now, Culpeper describes this recipe as a pretty cordial which resists the pestilence and is a good antidote in pestilential times, resisting poison and strengthening the stomach. And it was a popular cure-all. Mithridate electuary was a similar product, an antidote resisting poison, venom, and putrefaction. Diascordium was yet another supposedly useful in female complaints. And this is one of the original jars that from the 17th century that we've got in Apothecaries Hall. This is English Delftware. Now, species were the next thing on the list. It's just another name for raw ingredients of herbs and spices. But Wally's lists include 1.5 ounces of lumbricus, or earthworms, which were astonishingly in the College of Physicians Pharmacopoeia in a water or a spirit of earthworms. So you can see that right in the middle, and you can read the old writing as well of lumbricus, 1.5 ounces. However, by this time, even this and other animal products were going out of fashion. And Nicholas Culpeper's commentary says of the use of earthworms, "'Tis a mess altogether." There are also groups of oils and emplasters which are just plasters, as well as what are described as chemical oils. In other words, products from the new groups of medicines being employed. And amongst his chemical oils, he includes oil of vitriol, which is sulfuric acid, very much a chemical rather than a herbal product. And these containers here are the sort of containers that you would have had oils in, although I have to admit, these ones, again from Apothecaries Hall, are not English. The list of lozenges includes troch hystericae, a formula including birthwort and feverfew, which was supposed to expel both the birth and the afterbirth, to cleanse women after labour, and according to Culpeper, to expel the relics of a careless midwife. And by this, I think he means the placenta. The unguenta are ointments, and here we have a list including the nicotine. I'm glad that was mentioned by Helen. This is a rather poor pot that we have at Apothecaries Hall, but it's the only one we've got that actually says nicotine in it, but it has actually been broken and put back together again. Most of our pots are rather better than this one. So this one is nicotine or tobacco ointment. Culpeper says, "It would take a whole summer's day to write the particular virtues of this ointment, and my poor genius is too weak to give it the 100th part of its due praise." So you can see that there's 4 ounces of nicotine ointment there in the middle. It's got a bit of a blot on it on the original, but it is all there along with the other ointments. Culpeper says, "It cures tumours, imposthumes, wounds, ulcers, gunshot, stinging with nettles, bees, wasps, hornets, venomous beasts, wounds made with poisoned arrows, etc." And so here is, as I say, the ointment jar from the collection at Apothecaries Hall. It certainly sounds to be a wonderful cure-all. The greater part of his list, however, appears to be raw ingredients, and they would have been used in preparing medicines. He's got quantities of aloes, benzoin, cloves, mace, storax, and also listed is saffron, turmeric, and mercury. As this list shows, I think it's this list, or it might be the next one. No, go back again, sorry. Stick with that list. As his list shows, some of the ingredients would have been culinary, showing the close relationship between apothecaries and grocers. Moving on, finally, we have a clue to his practice, because along with glasses and pots are listed lancets and incision knives. And one can speculate that perhaps he did occasionally engage in the bleeding of his patients at a time when the letting of blood was thought to be a valid medical procedure to cool the humours. So he wasn't meant to be doing this because he was stepping on the physician's toes, but it seemed to be the thing that came into practice in any case for many apothecaries. One thing that does seem rather strange is that there is no mention of any books. Wally would have been likely to have had some reference books. Perhaps such a valuable resource was removed by members of the family before the inventory was completed, especially if his brother was a physician. This is, for example, a bleeding bowl that was, it's French actually, but that's the sort of thing that would have been used with the lancets to bleed somebody, a little cutout for the neck hole, wherever the bleeding was taking place from. It seems as though he may not have had, he may have had books, but they don't show in his inventory. So perhaps they were removed prior to that. But in conclusion, I think we can see that Wally was probably a fairly typical provincial apothecary, perhaps of the poorer sort, but still carrying a good range of the stock standard at the time. As for the apothecary in Romeo and Juliet, we're not told if he got away with his dangerous sale to Romeo, but my guess is that with an inquest coming up involving 2 deaths in the powerful Montague and Capulet families, he would have been wise to make himself scarce. Thank you. I'll hand back.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. So, pills, potions, and poisons. Well, we have seen plenty of pills and remedies in the past hour or so. Now it's time to talk about potions and poisons. I am a lecturer in chemistry at the Technical University in Milano, and I really, as a sort of a pastime, I really enjoy digging into the history of chemistry, learning new things on how the history of the science developed. I already collaborated with Helen and with the Nantwich Museum a couple of years ago. It was a very interesting, very successful event. And when Helen told me that there was going to be an exhibition on a 1600s pharmacy, I said, okay, this is going to be fun. We should do something about it. So today I'm going to talk about some of the chemistry and the medicine of those days. And I'll try to show you, or at least I've done my best to show you some live chemistry, some live demonstrations of those procedures that people like Raphe Walley and all the apothecaries were carrying out on a daily basis. So I would like to start with this question. Now you've heard a lot about this. Close your eyes and imagine the apothecary shop. Imagine what you would see in one of those shops. You probably, I guess most of you, imagine something like shelves, very dusty, loaded jars with all sorts of herbs and chemicals and the tools, mortars and pestles and so on. But I bet at least some of you picture something like this, which is quite similar in a sense. But you notice on the shelf in the window facing the street, these large glass bottles containing water-based solution with bright colors. And that would be actually a very right guess. This was a very common sight when you were walking past an apothecary. And at the time when most customers couldn't really read signs and everything, this was the most clear indication that this is a chemist shop, an apothecary shop. Some ancient looking shops still display them nowadays. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about these iconic items. These are known as advertising carboys, or sometimes show globes, sometimes show jars. And that's because that's exactly what they are for, just for show. So no sane apothecary would keep a solution of a valuable product on the shelf like that, because of course the sunlight might damage it and you would probably even get it stolen somehow. So those were mainly designed for show. Here I can show you a few examples. Well, as you can see, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They have sometimes very rich decoration, sometimes they are a bit more plain. They are often hand-blown because they're really large. If you compare the size of these against a bottle of wine, you can see they can reach really, really large dimensions. And we must admit they are really a beautiful sight even today. And depending on how wealthy the apothecary could be, as you can see from this catalog from the 1890s, they could have been even engraved, like the two examples in the bottom here, or even decorated with brass or even gold ornaments around the neck and maybe tripods on the base and so on. For the effective use, of course, these needed to be filled with brightly colored solutions with some chemicals, mainly water solutions, that had very colors. And I thought this was a really fascinating subject. It's not only a beautiful display, but also a good idea to start with for our demonstrations. So I tried to look for some large glass flasks, the largest containers I could obtain. And I wanted to show you how to display some colorful solutions in the same way as an apothecary would have done that. But the point also was, what shall we put in it? So I wanted to try to recreate the atmosphere of the shop using the same materials and the same chemicals that we would find in the inventory that we just observed before. But also the choice of the colors of the solution was definitely not random at all. And it turns out that if you read the literature of the time, you could see that there are many theories about the pattern, the schemes of colors that were chosen to fill these bottles. Some people claim that they were the colors of the waters of sacred rivers. Some people claim that they represented maybe with reddish and bluish color the different types of blood, the blood that runs in veins and the blood that runs in arteries, but that's probably a more modern idea. Some people even put forward very crazy ideas, such as the fact that in coastal towns, the red and green colors were used to direct ships and to guide sailors towards the shore. That is probably a bit stretched. But one of my, probably my favorite theory was able to account for the most typical combination of 4 colors reported, which is red, yellow, black, and the bluish green. And that has something to do with the most important, the leading medical theory of the time. That's the so-called theory of the 4 humors that we heard briefly mentioned before. Something that's more than 1,000 years old, something that lasted for a very long time for several good reasons. And that's all due to the work of, well, mainly due to Hippocrates, of course, the Greek physician that lived about 400 years before Christ, that was named the father of modern medicine, of course, and was the first character to introduce medicine as a proper science, as a scientific discipline. And also he's very famous for the Hippocratic Oath, that was, of course, the type of declaration of intents that every new physician and doctor of medicine has to take to ensure that he will comply to the ethical practices of the profession. So Hippocrates introduced this idea of the humors. He thought that when people were sick, were ill, they had one of 4 of these fluids coming out of their body. And he called them humors, which is the Greek word for fluid. So a healthy body would have a balance, a perfect balance, the right amounts of each of them. And an ill body would have an excess of one of those that would spill out somehow. That is a very interesting idea that was taken and modified a little bit later by Galen, maybe 500 years later, and developed it even further to show the so-called theory of balance. You could easily interact and modify the levels of these humors by taking care of what you take in, medicines or food and so on. The famous statement, "we are what we eat," is attributed to him in this direction. So this idea of the 4 humors was still the leading medical theory at the time of Raphe Walley. So what are these four humors? Well, some of them are quite easy to our understanding. An example is blood. Even though blood would be made of the blood humor, would not be just a pure humor, but of course we all know what blood is. Yellow bile, also known as choler, was something very unpleasant, something regurgitated from the stomach when it's empty, with a very bitter, really awful taste. Without going too much into the details, but you can imagine what I'm talking about. Black bile was also equally unpleasant, was anything related to intestinal secretions that are somehow, well, now we know it's due to maybe clotted blood and that sort of effect, but for the theory of the time, it was a different type of fluid that was a symptom of something not going very well with your body. And also the last one is a quite a peculiar word with a different type of pronunciation compared to the spelling. That's phlegm, which is an umbrella term to cover anything whitish or watery that would come from your lungs or from your throat, sort of mucus, saliva, or that sort of secretions. So these 4 elements had to be present. You had to have enough of each one, but not too much of any of them. That was the theory of the 4 humors. And that is actually a really complicated system. It's a philosophical system. They saw connections between these humors and all sorts of other fields. For example, they could link them to the 4 elements, to the Aristotelian theory provided by Empedocles on the structure of matter. Matter is made of air, fire, earth, and water, and each of the elements is connected, somehow is linked to one of the humors. Or also even more interestingly, for the medical purposes, they could link each humor to some sort of character of the symptoms. So if you had, for example, a very hot fever, you are very likely to have an excess of blood, because blood was recognized to be hot and wet. Or, for example, seasons as well. If you connect phlegm with winter, then you understand why a cold is more common during the winter, because you get a runny nose, a cough, and so on. These connections were quite common, and they were also very interesting to see in the development of the theory as well. And even most, what I find most interesting, even more, trying to read more deeply into the physiology, they could associate the humors to the so-called temperaments. So if you had an excess of blood, you would be called a sanguine character, a sanguine temperament, which would mean that you are very cheerful, very energetic, very happy on average. If you had an excess of yellow bile, you would probably be called choleric, which means very quick-tempered, very bossy, very argumentative. And Galen himself thought he was in this category. If you had an excess of black bile, you would be called a melancholic temperament, which means we could say sad, maybe depressed, and so on. And if you had an excess of phlegm, you would be called phlegmatic, which means very calm, very unemotional, very reasoning type of character. So these were called the temperaments. And you can see in these woodcuts how the excess of one of the humors would appear physically on the physical appearance of the person because of this temperament. That is a very interesting and very curious connection between symptoms, between disease, between cures, and between the constitution of the body. So in this little summary that I'd like to show, you can see also not only the connections that I mentioned, some more as well, for example, with the life, the stages of life and so on, but also the fact that you can arrange these 4 humors into a square. So you could have a humor and its opposite. So sometimes treatment of an excess of blood, for example, could be done by removing some blood, for example, by bloodletting with leeches or with sharp instruments. Or also, on the other hand, you could introduce an excess of the opposite humor, for example, black bile in this case. So it is a rather complex theory, and that is what I'd like to use as a starting point to show you a little demonstration. So I wanted to recreate some display solutions using only the ingredients that were available at the time. For yellow bile, I decided to choose something very simple, spice that was very well turmeric. Turmeric is a very bright yellow color due to some saturated organic compounds present in it that are very good antioxidants. You can see there the word turmeric taken from the inventory, directly from the inventory of Raphe Walley's shop. You can see on the right side, I cut out an excerpt from the pharmacopoeia that says that turmeric is a hot spice. It's hot in the 3rd degree. It's used to open obstructions, and it's useful, it's profitable against yellow jaundice. That is not surprising. It's something yellow used to treat a disease that would make you yellow. You can see clearly a connection. And of course, some positive aspects you could always find because there were very many antioxidant molecules, antioxidant compounds in this type of material. So we'll make a little solution of this. We'll make a tincture of turmeric by dissolving it in ethanol and dilute that to make our yellow solution. For the black bile, it's obviously very easy to find something that is already black, but I wanted to start showing also some chemical reactions. So I'm going to choose this rather odd combination, a combination of grain vitriol and tea. So grain vitriol is bright aqua green colored powder. It's an iron salt. It's called the vitriol of Mars or grain vitriol. Vitriol is an old chemical or maybe an alchemical term for sulfates, for all the salts of sulfuric acid. And the green salt of sulfuric acid is iron sulfate. So it's an iron salt that contains sulfate ions. It was very well known at the time, was used for you see also there the word vitriol from the inventory. The combination of vitriol with tea gives this the black color that I'm after. So tea was also described in pharmacopoeias and in herbal manuals, as you can see here in the excerpt, is very salutary for violent headaches and sicknesses by inebriation. This is also a remedy that we would like to try out maybe ourselves. So the combination of these 2 ingredients, which are not black at all, will give a very dark black colloidal suspension that we will use to simulate black bile. This is because the iron ions in the vitriol react with the tannins, with some polyphenols present in the tea. And we know now the chemistry between these 2 components. It forms a complex ion, which is really dark black. And actually today, still we use iron tannate, this combination of iron and tannic acid, as an iron supplement. Sometimes people can take it in as a compensation for low levels of iron in the blood. To represent blood, I went for one of the most classical red dyes ever produced by of this beautiful plant. This is the madder root. This is the madder plant, which has bright red to brownish roots. And since the earliest of times, this root has been recognized as a good source for red dyes. You can lyophilize or grind up the dry root and use some alkali, for example, we'll be using potash, to extract a very powerful, very intense red dye that was used even in the Middle Ages or even before to color cloth and fabric. On the bottom here, in the other usual excerpt that I show to prove to you that it's really employed in the medical knowledge of the time, it is shown to be a herb of Mars, which is not surprising because of its color, and it has opening qualities. It's used to open the obstructions of the spleen and to diminish the melancholy humor. And that's not surprising because melancholy is the opposite of, melancholy is black bile, which is the opposite of blood. Something red to compensate for the missing bit of blood, which is on the opposite side of the spectrum of black bile. So again, you can see that the theory has some sense after all. And finally, for phlegm, I have here a combination of 3 components: blue vitriol, ammonia, and lettuce. Actually, you can use any green vegetable, but I thought lettuce has an interesting application in pharmacology. So blue vitriol, again, is a vitriol. It's so-called Roman vitriol. You can see there's an abbreviation of the word Rom before vitriol. It means Roman vitriol. It's a blue vitriol, which is copper sulfate, the vitriol of Venus. And ammonia also was very well known from the time. And you can see also ammoniaca, the Latin spelling for ammonia, on the inventory in the picture there. We combine these two. These two give a very intense blue complex. Again, it's a complex ion between the copper and the ammonia. This gives a very dark, intense blue color. And this is way too blue for representing the aqua green color that was normally used for the phlegm. So I needed to add something green to combine with the blue color and give the correct shade. And I chose anything containing chlorophyll. And lettuce was used, as you can see again in the pharmacopoeia, to lose the belly, for example, or to ease griping pains in the stomach or bowels that come of color. This is supposed to be wet and cold, so it's compensating for color. So I tried to put all of this together in a little video. I hope the streaming quality will be good enough. We will try to do all that, all the chemistry that I just described very quickly, and see what happens when we display the 4 solutions. So here we have the turmeric. This is just plain turmeric, as you could buy it still today in shops. And we're going to make a tincture out of it, which is a solution of the soluble components in pure ethanol, pure alcohol, spirit of wine, as they would have called it. You need to macerate, to steep the dry material for. And actually there are very many yellow soluble components in the turmeric that dissolves very readily in the alcohol. You just filter the solution and you have your yellow water. And for the black bile, we have here the tea, freshly made tea. This is Earl Grey tea of the highest quality, combined with iron sulfate, with the green vitriol. As you can see, none of the 2 ingredients is black. You get a very dark, bright black precipitate. It's a suspension of iron tannate, and we will use this to simulate the black bile. And this is the powdered madder root. We need just some hot water. The process is a little slower. I just got a warning that the connection is not very stable, so I hope everyone can still hear me. This is the suspension of the madder root in hot water. We just keep stirring it for maybe a few hours, 2-3 hours. And when the solution had reached the correct shade, we add the caustic not the caustic potash, just the plain potash. This is potassium carbonate, and the base releases the blood red color, as you can see there. Filtration is also a necessary operation. Rafe was probably doing this on a daily basis, filtering to remove the insoluble component, and you get the beautiful, clear, blood red solution that we will dilute later. And finally, for the phlegm, we have a solution which is a very beautiful, that you can see on the left side. You can barely see the blue color in that solution, but as soon as we add a few drops of ammonia, that blue color will become extremely intense. It's a very intense absorption of the correct colors for the solution to give a very bright blue appearance. And then we add the tincture, again, the solution of chlorophyll from the lettuce into pure ethanol. The combination of the two, again, gives a very dark complex, which is the right color, an aqua green, aquamarine type of. So we have our 4 concentrated extracts. Let's move to the larger glass flasks that you can see here. These contain only distilled water, plain water. And if you add the concentrated solutions, you reach the desired shade to display on your windowsill. This is the turmeric solution to represent the yellow bile. That's the black complex of iron and tea to represent black bile. This is the madder root, which gives a blood red color, and also the complex mixture of ammonia, copper, and chlorophyll to give an aqua green. These are the 4 solutions ready to display on the window, representing the 4 humors of the body. We can dilute to get to the right level, and also to help mixing the solutions, because the very concentrated ones sometimes can segregate somehow. So to mix them very well, we just add a little bit more water. And also, when those flasks, those carboys and globes were displayed on the shelves, normally they were also illuminated somehow, maybe with lanterns or with some mirrors. So I decided to use a little bit more modern technology, just placing an LED light behind. And when it goes on, we can somehow complete our display of the 4 humors. There it is. Yeah, that's actually quite a beautiful display, which is the closest we can get to the chemistry of the apothecary. Again, one more from a darkened background, which is always quite nice to see. Yeah, there you go. So, of course, this theory of the humors seems quite silly to us. Nowadays, we know physiology, we know the history of medicine, and we know the modern theories. So this is really a bit difficult to accept. But this was the theory for hundreds of years, mainly for 3 reasons. So it was very respectful towards tradition, towards Aristotle, towards the philosophies of the natural philosophy of the time. It was heavily supported by the church, because the idea of the perfect balance of humors was somehow a reflection, was seen as a reflection of God's work, the perfection and so on. And also it kind of made sense. People could relate to it, could understand the relationship, could understand the yellow cures yellow, you need to remove blood when you have an excess of blood. It was very accessible, let's say. The humorism theory then became, started to fall out of favor in the 1800s, more or less, because of the advent of germ theory. We now know that the problem is not an excess of humors, but it's parasites, viruses, and bacteria, and germs, and so on. But still, in spite of all this, the pharmacists still recognize this idea of associating their shop with the picture of the flask containing a colorful solution. So even in the 18th and 19th century, still there was an interest in publishing and producing new recipes to display colorful effects on the apothecaries' shop windows. Even in pharmacies, as I said in the beginning, even modern pharmacies sometimes have this type of display. And I found here a very mysterious recipe, as I decided to call it, because when I read it for the first time, looking up some material for this talk, I thought to myself, this is never going to work. It's a waste of time. It's crazy. This will never do what it says in the recipe. And I had to be corrected, actually, because it is really an effective recipe, and I decided to show you this one as well. This is a bit more complicated than the previous one. It contains 6 different components that we need to prepare separately, but I will try to summarize them all in the second video. These are also some of the procedures that the apothecary would have done on a daily basis. It's dissolution, filtration, distillation, and so on, all sorts of practical skills that the apothecary, or maybe even the apprentice of the apothecary, would have been carrying out every day. So the first component is actually something that was not available to Raphe Walley. It was something that was discovered a little bit later. It is chloroform. It's a chlorinated solvent that was used for anesthetic purposes in medicine for many years, but not at the time of Raphe Walley. It was a bit later. So chloroform is a very good solvent. It's a non-water miscible solvent, and we can dye it with a green color using some leaves. I'm using some celery leaves. So the chlorophyll of the leaves leaches into the chloroform and gives it a green color. That's the first component. Second component is just plain glycerin. Glycerin is a colorless viscous liquid, and we'll just use it straight as it is. The third component is castor oil. Castor oil is produced by cold pressing castor beans, and it's dyed with a red color using alkanet, which is a root still used nowadays as a source of red dyes, especially for temporary tattoos. It's used for making the ink of those temporary tattoos. It's a root that leaches a red color in oily materials, so the castor oil will get the red color from this root. The fourth component is a very precise water alcohol mix, so it's a mixture of water and the spirit of wine, the distilled spirit of wine, that we will dye blue using indigo carmine. Also, indigo carmine was dates a little bit later compared to Raphe Walley's time. It was derived from the sulfonation of indigo, which is an ancient natural material with a blue color, using sulfuric acid. Indigo and sulfuric acid were known to Raphe Walley. Particular sulfuric acid was known as oil of vitriol, but the combination of the two to give a soluble dye was discovered. The fifth component is just sunflower oil. Really, you can use any vegetable oil with a low density, for example, peanut oil or even olive oil. And we need to dye with a different color again, in yellow, using, for example, curry paste, or we could use saffron or turmeric, anything that leaches a yellow color in an oily material. And finally, last, pure alcohol that we will color pink using anything from the flower or plant origin that contains a pink or red pigment. In my case, I'm using hibiscus flowers because they are very easily available in dry form. So it looks like a lot of work. I tried to condense it into an 8-9 minutes video. I'll see what we can do with these 6 components once we've prepared them. So here we see the celery leaves, just recently washed. We'll just treat them with some pure chloroform. Probably my health and safety advisor would not be very happy if she saw this video of me handling chloroform outside of a fume hood with bare hands. But it's all for a good cause, for the cause of science, and also as people used to do these things at the time, safety was probably not the first priority. It's just very small amounts anyway. As soon as you press those leaves into the solvent, you can see the green color leaching out. That's due to the chlorophyll present in the plant. Of course, now we know the precise chemical structure of the chlorophyll. It is a greenish solution. It's not a very bright green color, but that's the color of chlorophyll in organic solvent. You transfer it to a bottle for later use by removing all the plant material that we don't need. I'll try to prepare the 6 solutions, put them in different containers, and then we'll combine them at the very end. This is just plain glycerol. You can see it's a colorless liquid. It's very viscous, very syrupy, and it was a subproduct of the production of soap. Every time you would make soap, you would end up with a lot of glycerol that you wouldn't necessarily need. Here, the alkanet root. This is dried powdered root. It looks like brownish as most of the bark and roots, but this leaches out a red color. And we combine it with the castor oil. Castor oil is a rather dense, oily material, but it's produced by cold pressing castor beans, the seeds, the beans of the castor plant. As you can see, it's much more viscous than, for example, olive oil. And at first here, it seems that nothing is happening, but if you press, keep grinding and working up the 2 components together, after a few hours, after a lot of pain in your elbows and hands, you start to see some bright red color leaching out. This is a slow process. It requires a few hours up to a few days, depending on the temperature of the oil. but that also can happen spontaneously if you are happy to invest more time into this. Filtering this solution was a nightmare. This took a very, very long time. The solution is so viscous that even using a tiny, tiny plug of cotton wool, this took about 2 days to filter for the amount that I needed for this demonstration. But of course, you can do something else in the meantime. That's also part of the time management skills of the apothecary. And for the fourth component, we have here some water. This is plain water from the tap, or from the well, as they would have said, probably. It needs to be combined with some pure ethanol. You know the shape of the stopper of the bottle of ethanol. You can remove the cap, pour the ethanol, and put the cap back on using just one hand without ever putting the stopper on the table to avoid picking up contaminations. That's one of the reasons why those bottles had that shape and that type of cap. We mix thoroughly the two solutions, the two chemicals, the two components, water and ethanol, to get this solution, which is pretty much like a strong vodka. Okay, it's a strong solution of alcohol water. It has to be exactly the right proportion because it has to be correct. It has to have the correct density. So we need to measure precisely the two components. And as we said before, we dye this with a blue material. This is the indigo carmine, sulfonated indigo, which gives an extremely dark, extremely intense blue color. It can be used even as an ink. And if you take just a few drops of this concentrated solution and add them to the water and alcohol mix, you get the pale blue shade that you need. It's very easy to overdo this. If you put too much of it, you need to start all over again. But being a bit careful with the amounts, you can easily obtain the desired shade. So there we have the fourth component, which is a blue solution. The fifth is any light oil, in this case sunflower oil, which, as you can see, is already slightly yellow. Those are the sunflower seeds where the oil is extracted from. The oil is already yellow on its own, but it's a rather pale color, so it is necessary to make it stand out even better, to make the yellow shade a little darker. So the color can be enhanced with so many different organic molecules, plants and herbs and spices, but we already have a solution of a yellow dye available in our kitchen. This is curry paste. So if you take a tiny bit of curry paste, which is actually a mixture of many herbs and spices with a yellow color, just add a few drops to the oil and you get, you get something you can do in your kitchen to season your dishes, but also something that you can use for chemical purposes, as I'm about to do. A yellow solution of different herbs in sunflower oil. And last but not least, the dried hibiscus powder. These are petals of the hibiscus flowers. They are sold in some countries as under the name of carcade. It's an infusion that people drink like tea and coffee. But the peculiarity of these petals is that they leach out in alcohol a most beautiful pink color very, very quickly. Again, seems that nothing is happening, but as soon as you start grinding them up with a pestle, you see immediately the bright magenta pink color coming out. It's really pleasant to see. It's actually very easy to overdo this. Again, you could easily make the shade too dark and make it too similar to the red solution we made before. So we might want to dilute it down a little bit with more ethanol to make sure that the shade is the correct one. And again, it's also you need to do everything by eyeballing quantities, as the apothecary probably would have done. They had recipes with weights and measures, but for volumes, probably doing it by eye would be the best sign of dealing with a professional. And again, we filter the solution to remove the petals, and we have our sixth and last component, a solution of hibiscus flowers, or the soluble components of hibiscus flowers in ethanol. So here we have our beautiful display of 6 solutions, 6 materials ready to combine. And the recipe just said, pour them all together. And I didn't really believe this until I actually did it. This is the chloroform, we pour glycerol on top. And you can see that the glycerol, well, it's not difficult to predict, but the glycerol doesn't mix with the chloroform at all. Glycerol is water soluble and it doesn't mix with this solvent. So it layers on top. So we form a layer on top of the other layer. It's a bit like oil and water. They don't mix and they layer on top of each other. The thing is that the 6 components have been chosen in a very specific way to achieve precisely this effect. There we go with the third solution, the alkanet root in castor oil. And lo and behold, we have a third layer forming on top. This is a very viscous solution, but again, it's an oil, so it does not mix with the glycerol. It would mix with the chloroform, but they are separated by the layer of glycerol. So they form 3 beautiful, neat, separate layers. Really amazing to see. And we have here 3 layers now. You probably understood how this is going to end, but it is a really fascinating process, so we will enjoy the show. The solution of water and alcohol is very heavily water-based, so again, it doesn't mix with the oil of with the castor oil. The castor oil is more dense than the water and alcohol solution, so it stays below the new layer, and the layer forms on top. And even if I pour it slightly faster, maybe with more energy, still maybe we lift some droplets from the bottom, but the 2 layers do not want to interact with each other. That is really beautiful to see. And then the olive oil, again, olive oil is hydrophobic, it doesn't mix with water, so it layers on top of the solution of water and alcohol, and we form a yellow layer on top of the blue layer. That horrible effect that you see on the left side is just because there is an air bubble trap there. It's a flat air bubble that looks magnified by the liquid, but in a minute we will get rid of it to avoid spoiling the display. So we have now 5 layers, and we add the 6th one, which is a beautiful pink hibiscus solution in ethanol. You can see here I got somehow carried out, and I almost carried away, and I almost poured it through the layers, but still the be disturbed too easily, so we can pour this off in a slightly faster way. So each pair of liquids is made of 2 immiscible liquids, so something that cannot mix with each other. So in pairs, these liquids will never mix. And this display is stable for a very long time. I've done the video 2 months ago, and I still have that display without it being considerably affected. Of course, you have to cap it because the top layer is ethanol and will evaporate. But even if you forget to cap it, you can always top it up. So 6 immiscible components in one single glass. And you can imagine in the 18th or 19th century, seeing something like this on the shelf of a pharmacy would definitely tell you something about the skill of the operator. For the third experiment that I'd like to show you, I think we can get back to the beginning of this session that we had this evening, where Nick introduced the talk with the quote from Romeo and Juliet, "What, ho apothecary, let me have a dram of poison." I don't know exactly what poison that was, but surely the apothecary would have a very large selection, a vast selection at his disposal. If we look at the inventory, again, the Rafe's inventory, we can see on the same page, on the right side of the page, not 1, not 2, but even 3 horribly toxic heavy metals. So poisons that come from the same kingdom, somehow from the kingdom of heavy metal minerals, and they are specifically mercury, lead in the form of red lead and white lead, and arsenic. Well, I don't need to tell you how common and how widespread these things were in the pharmacopoeias and in the recipes, but I'll probably show you a few facts about these 3. And of course, I will conclude with a demonstration with these 3 horribly deadly heavy metals. Lead was rarely used as such. It was used mainly in the form of compounds, as we said before. And one of the most common compounds of lead available was this rather innocuous-looking crystalline powder, which, by the way, has a very sweet taste, so it's extremely easy to get poisoned with this. It's known as sugar of lead, of course, because of its taste, and you can see there a label from a little bit later than the time of Raphe Walley, of course, because it was still sold for many other applications. It's known as Saccharum Saturni. Again, we saw before iron was associated with Mars, copper with Venus, the sun, of course, with gold, the moon with silver, and lead was associated with the planet Saturn. So this was called sugar of lead or sugar of Saturn. It is, of course, deadly toxic because it's a soluble salt of lead, so it will carry the ions of the heavy metal into your body where they will do great harm. And it says here in the excerpt, this is very importantly, so they knew already that was kind of toxic, but it had some applications to against the gonorrhea and to assuage bodily lust. Apparently, that would definitely kill, literally, would kill the bodily lust. I'll show you here just one formula, which I really like from a Copland recipe book, which is written in Latin, but I can try to give you a feeling for that. It says plumbi acetatis, which is the acetate of lead, it's sugar of lead. You dissolve it in rose water, you add oxymel, which is a mixture of honey and vinegar, was used very commonly in medical preparations. Then tincture of opium and tincture of digitalis. You make a so-called haustus, which is a medication that you would take by mouth, like a syrup or something to drink. And then it says quartis vel sextis oris sumendus, which means you take it every 4 or every 6 hours, probably until you die, because it contains lead, which is really toxic. It contains opium, which is horribly addictive, so you would need to take more and more to get the same effect. And also digitalis for good measure, which is another toxic alkaloid. So that is an example of a recipe that I would not recommend to anyone. But you can clearly see how lightly these materials were used in medical preparations. The second one that I'm mentioning is mercury, because it's my favorite element. It's so beautiful. If you ever had the opportunity to look at some real mercury, it's absolutely amazing. But do you think they would really use mercury as such? So pure mercury metal, quicksilver in medications? Of course they did. They had massive jars filled to the brim with this very toxic heavy metal, releasing vapors in the environment. Absolutely crazy. That was absolutely true. I have some recipes to show you in a minute. But the most common form of mercury was this material here, showed in the form of a soap bar. It's actually a soap bar that contains this chemical. It's called the corrosive sublimate, or mercurius sublimatus corrosivus in Latin, which means something that is, of course, corrosive to materials and to skin, and something that you can sublime, that you can purify easily by sublimation. And that is mercury chloride, so it's a compound of mercury and chlorine that's soluble, so deadly, because it dissolves the mercury in your bloodstream and kills you in very many different ways. One comment by Culpeper in his Pharmacopoeia. This is an unguentum emulatum that contains mercury, and he says, my opinion of this ointment is it was invented for the itch. Without quicksilver, it will do no good. With quicksilver, it may do harm. So, of course, here I recognize already that there was not always a positive outcome of the treatment. Just a couple of recipes. You can see here on the left side, a treatment for ulcers and sores, that is made using the mercury sublimate, so this corrosive sublimate, and other different components. Or here, a medicine that apparently was in high request in Italy. This is a book by the great chemist Robert Boyle that also studied some medical preparations. And it is a recipe against the worms of children. I've never heard of that before, but apparently you can get rid of worms by treating them with pure quicksilver, with pure mercury metal. I suspect you wouldn't kill only the worms, but that's my personal view to it. And lastly, another really interesting story. We could talk about arsenic for 2 hours, but we'll just keep it very brief. The most common form of arsenic is not the element, is a compound that is known as arsenic trioxide or arsenous acid, also known as inheritance powder, because it was used very, very liberally to dispose of undesired relatives and lovers, and even popes and emperors. Italians were really good at doing this during the past centuries, of course. Luckily, then the methods to detect arsenic poisoning became much more precise and effective, so there is no danger anymore to be poisoned to use arsenic as a weapon somehow. But still, arsenic marked the story of medical preparations. The very first treatment for syphilis was an arsenic compound known as salvarsan, which really saved a lot of lives. And very interesting, I didn't know that. I found this out when looking up for some material for today. It is still used nowadays. It's a chemotherapeutic for some specific types of leukemia, or some sort of irreversible damage, because it's quite good at killing cells where they use a chemotherapeutic agent. I didn't really expect something so toxic to be directly injected in people, but it seems to give very good results, and it is one of the best treatments for some types of leukemias. But that's not what I want to talk about concerning arsenic. On a slightly brighter note, brighter in all senses, arsenic was used to make green pigments that were used everywhere. They were used in wallpaper, they were used in paintings, they were used even in dresses and in sweets. So you can imagine how easily people could get poisoned. The chemical could be dispersed in the air when you are suspending it into the oil to make the pigment. It could be in contact with your skin if you're wearing a dress like this one. But the color was so beautiful, so fascinating, that it was employed for very many years. And also compounds of arsenic like this one mentioned here, the Paris green, were used as insecticides for a rather long period. So these are three examples, just very, very quickly, some three examples of the chemistry and some of the medicinal applications of these three elements. I'd like to show you also a little experiment with three solutions containing the three compounds that we discussed. On the glass, on the wine glass on the left side, we have some solution of the sugar of Saturn, so lead acetate. The middle glass contains the sublimatus corrosivus, and the mercury chloride. And on the right side, a solution of deadly white arsenic. Drinking that glass would probably kill you after a couple of days of very bad pain. In the back of the display, you can see also three colorless or almost colorless solution. One of them is a bit bluish, and will react with the three chemicals to give beautiful pigments. So on the left side, we have a precipitation of a bright lead containing pigment, it's lead iodide. In the middle, we have a solution of, again, an iodine containing compound that gives a mercury iodide. It's very similar to vermilion that was used for painting. And also on the right side, as you can see, the very impressive green shade of the Paris green, of the copper acetoarsenite. Three deadly colors that will give a very bright appearance to any painting or manuscript or so on. Actually, these were used in miniatures, in hand-transcribed books in the Middle Ages. They were used in frescoes sometimes in the maybe Renaissance or later. Some were used by the Impressionists. There are still very famous paintings containing some of these pigments. And in spite of their really horrible system, these colors will remain through history. Of course, nowadays we are trying to move away from toxic chemicals for paintings. And lastly, in the very few minutes that are left, because I think we are getting towards the end, I wanted to mention, I really wanted to end with the bang. There's always a good excuse to end chemical demonstrations with something explosive, and this is not difficult at all if we look at the inventory, because the apothecary was clearly the most dangerous shop in any town or village, I think, by far, because of the range of materials that were stored and kept in there. And if you consider also that, as Nick mentioned, there was, for the early days at least, no need for a professional qualification to practice as an apothecary, that was kind of a recipe for disaster. And several disasters did occur indeed. So you can see, for example, 1868, a piece of the Nottinghamshire Guardian, a terrific explosion in a chemist's shop in Mansfield Road in Nottingham, and an explosion that took place in the shop of Mr. Fletcher, chemist and druggist, resulting in the instant death of a boy and injuries to no fewer than 7 other people. An explosion of truly frightful character, a loud report resembling that of a 72-pounder cannon. Quite impressive. Of course, in that case, they were making a mixture to produce matches. And that brings me to a very interesting point. The apothecary, the pharmacy, the chemist was actually the point of contact for anyone who wanted to buy chemistry-related materials, including maybe pigments sometimes, maybe, as I said, matches or fireworks or tiny toys based on the chemical properties of the materials, or even maybe photographic chemicals in later stages when photography was invented. So they had at their disposal many of these materials, and they could have very dangerous operations going on in the back of the shop. So looking at the inventory, we could find simple ingredients like this: saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate. It's a very common component of a specific thing that I'm going to mention in a minute. Or things like sulfur, sulfur vivum, yeah, flowers of sulfur, beautiful yellow powders. It is very common also in pharmaceutical applications of the time, in medical applications of the time. And I have here a recipe that combines both. We have brimstone or flower of brimstone used to help coughs, rotten phlegm, and also to take away leprosies and yellow jaundice. Again, something yellow treating a disease that makes you yellow. We keep seeing these connections all the time. Especially being mixed with saltpeter. Wait a minute, this is a combination of saltpeter and sulfur. That is basically lacking just charcoal to make gunpowder. Okay, so they were dispensing to people a mixture of sulfur and saltpeter, which is definitely a very flammable mixture, as we will see in a second. So the combination of these 3 ingredients, charcoal certainly was available at the time, would give you one of the most game-changing discoveries of the history of mankind, which is the combination of 75% potassium nitrate, 15% sulfur, here 10% charcoal, which is, of course, gunpowder. Okay, gunpowder was discovered in ancient times by the Chinese and refined over the years, but this could easily be made with components available in the pharmacy. So as a way to finish off, I think that's the best experiment to do. But of course, there were some restrictions. And for example, there is a document that kind of says, well, you shouldn't really do this. This is an Explosives Act of 1875. But they tried to stop people from making gunpowder illegally, or at least gunpowder should be manufactured only at factories lawfully existing or licensed under the Act. Of course, this was to protect people to avoid accidents like the one we saw in the newspaper. But fortunately, there is a little note in the bottom that said, provided that nothing in this section shall apply to the making of a small quantity of gunpowder for the purpose of chemical experiment and not for practical use for sale. So luckily we are safe. We can do this as long as it is for the purpose of chemical experiment. So with this, I would like to finish. These are the 3 components to make gunpowder. We need, of course, potassium nitrate that needs to be ground to a very, very fine state. Again, that's something that you can do with a bit of patience and a bit of hand, we could say elbow grease, yeah? This can take quite a bit of time, or an apprentice to do it for you. The finer it is, the better the quality of the gunpowder you will get. Of course, you don't get a very good quality gunpowder with the procedure that I'm showing you, because the industrial machines are much better at doing this. But once the powder is really fine, you add some charcoal. This is very fine already, so you don't need to powder it even further. But charcoal has a very porous, very spongy structure. So this procedure that I'm doing now with the mortar and pestle is meant to force tiny pieces of potassium nitrate and sulfur into the pores of the charcoal to make it more intimately mixed, more thoroughly mixed. This is done with incorporating mills in industrial scale. And that's much better than doing it by hand. After a few hours, if you haven't managed to blow yourself up, you have a beautiful batch of freshly made gunpowder, and we can exploit that not only by burning it, but also by making a little firecracker. So we have tube here, a paper tube made exclusively of paper. It's open on one end and sealed with tissue paper and tape on the other end. And also it has a little fuse that sticks out, which is made by coating some string with gunpowder, again with the same homemade gunpowder. We put in a few spatula tips of the charge, not too much of it because that could be quite dangerous. And then just for added effect, I'm adding iron filings, which will give some yellow sparks when the particles of iron are ignited and fly in the air. To build up a little pressure, I have a little plug of cotton wool just inserted very gently with a spatula, and that's our firework ready. So we're ready for the bang. We'll lay a little trail of gunpowder to light up the other fuse. And with this, I would like to conclude my exhibition of chemistry. I hope you can see and hear as well, because there's a sound. That's the trail burning. There we go. The fuse lighting, and there it is, the explosion of the firecracker. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you a very good evening. I hope you enjoyed looking at these videos as much as I did. Here we can see the still frame of the explosion, seeing all the little sparks due to the iron filings particle flying in the air. And experience, I'd like to acknowledge and thank very warmly the museum for inviting me, Helen personally, and all the staff who arranged the event. I'd like to acknowledge also my current university and my former university for all the support and for the time that I dedicated to this, and particularly the Cheshire Archives that allowed us to use the productions of the inventory this evening. Of course, all of you for your kind attention. If you need, we'll try to get some questions and answers in a minute if there is time, but also if you have more curiosities later on, here you can see my email address displayed, and you can send me an email in the future days or even years if you wish. Okay, I'll leave one more slide on for Helen, and I'm going to hand over the microphone. I hope everyone was able to hear and see everything correctly, and thank you very much once again.
Well, a huge thank you to all three of our speakers. It's been a really fascinating evening. I'm so glad that you managed to get on okay in the end, Fabio. I know you had a few technical difficulties. I think all of these talks have really complemented each other. I've definitely found it fascinating, and I'm sure everyone else has as well. If anyone does have a question or a comment, you feel free to put your cameras on and put your audio on as well. Quite happy, I think, all our speakers are to take any questions.